You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 179, Troy Greenwood and his midlife awakening. Well, hey friends, welcome to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I'm your host, Eric Nevins, and it is my joy and privilege to be here with you. Thank you so much for downloading, for listening. I hope that this conversation today will not only just stir your soul, but open you to maybe what God is doing in your life today. So today our guest is Troy Greenwood. He's the co-founder of Gracefull Cafe and Foundation. He's going to tell us what that means. I was just there yesterday, spent a couple hours with a friend, had some breakfast, and it has become one of my most favorite places in my little town. So I can't wait to share with you what Troy and the crew and his wife there are doing. So Troy, welcome to Halfway There. I love what you're doing over there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and Gracefull Cafe, and then after that, we'll go back and we'll kind of explore your story and how you got here.
Yeah, so 3.5 years ago, so May of 2016, my wife and I opened a community cafe called Gracefull Cafe and with an associated nonprofit called Gracefull Foundation. And one of the fundamental things we believe in is that everyone deserves one good meal a day, regardless of their ability to pay. So we set up Gracefull Cafe as a regular restaurant, so S Corp, legal terms. And then we have a nonprofit called Gracefull Foundation. And how that works is when you walk in, you're presented with a menu with prices, and you are able to get something from that menu. And then when it comes time to pay, we meet you wherever you are in your financial season. So if you're in a season where you have just enough, we ask you pay just what it costs. So a breakfast burrito is $5. And lunch is $8 plus whatever you do for a drink. If you're in a season where you don't have enough or anything, we would love for you to have that meal on us. So our foundation, in a sense, pays the cafe for your meal. And then finally, if you're in a season where you have a little extra or abundance, we ask that you pay it forward and pay for someone else's meal. And all those tips and extra goes to our nonprofit foundation for paying for other people's meals.
Yeah, which is a really cool idea. Where did you come up with that? I mean, that may be part of your story, so maybe we need to go back and do it. But
no, I mean that's a great question. We came up with it, I think. So a little bit of our story. We'll get into a lot of this, I know, later. But part of our story is my wife, for as long as I've known her, had talked in and out about having a restaurant, and she started her career as a CPA, and then she was a high school teacher. And I didn't really see how those had anything to do with a restaurant. So I don't know that I was that supportive of a husband on this dream. But after we got back from Uganda, which we'll get into, she came back just really wanting to open this restaurant. And so she started thinking about what it would look like and what some of the mission and the vision and the values would be and how that would be organized. And one of the things we came up along the way was this concept of gather, eat, give, of just being truly in community, that everyone should get one good meal a day. And finally, that how can we create a place where we inspire people to give back? And so out of that came some research into community cafes. There's the second one in the nation is here in town, and they've been around, I forget, over 10 years. They're called Same Cafe, and there's another one called Cafe 180. And both are beautiful things. And we started to really embrace what that community cafe model could look like. And we came up with a slightly different spin on it, but it's the same concept, just loving people through food and inviting people into community.
Right. Okay. Which is perfect. I think that's exactly what food does anyway, right? It creates a community, which is definitely what's going on over there. I just love it. So thank you. That's really helpful. And it's an interesting clientele too. The times I've been over there, right? You have people who are coming in and they can't afford it, and you guys are helping them. And like for me, it just is a really good way to get outside of my own bubble of what I think is important in my life, and to remember, hey, I've actually got it pretty good. I've got a roof over my head, and I've got a freezer full of food, and this cup of coffee is kind of a bonus. So that is kind of how I approach it. Well, let's get into your story, because I would love to hear how you got here. And the good news is you've shared it with me, and it's been a little while, so I get to approach it with fresh ears. So what did you grow? I can't remember where you grew up. Where did you grow up? And then was it a Christian family?
Yes. So I grew up in Michigan, and I was a PK. So my dad was a pastor.
Right.
So I was a preacher's kid. So I grew up very much a part of really two churches, because my dad was at two churches while I was growing up.
Gotcha. What was that like? Was being a preacher's kid the horror story we sometimes hear, or was it really good for you?
It was good for me. I mean, I've heard the same things. For me, people often ask about my faith journey, and I tell them that I went through several phases. But the first phase was my growing up phase, being a PK, and I grew up going to church because it was what we did to support my dad. It was his job, and we supported him. And so, like many PKs, I think I did every job there is to do at a church. One day I could be the acolyte. One day I could be in the nursery. One day I could run the sound system. It just wherever he needed me, I was there. And that was just what we did as a family. We supported my dad in his job.
Okay, but so it doesn't sound very personal to you at the time.
No, it wasn't, and that's kind of where I kind of say it was kind of, maybe phase one of my faith journey. The next phase was, I don't know, maybe a rest phase from church. I had kind of felt like, I'd done 2 Sundays a week for as long as I knew, missing very few. And so I kind of felt like I had checked the church box. And so through college and a little bit after out of college, my wife and I eventually, after we got married after college, we didn't go to church until we moved to Colorado in 2000. Around that time was when we started talking about having a family. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have kids, I think when you start to think about having kids, you think about your life a little bit and what you want to maybe change. And I thought we should add a church community as we did that. So again, it's still not personal, I'll say. I still went to church, not really for me, but because I was going to have kids and I wanted them to grow up in a church.
Interesting.
That's how I grew up.
Did you feel
kind of phase 3?
Yeah. Did you feel sort of separated from God, or just kind of God was out there, you were holding him at arm's length? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I would say I didn't have a very personal relationship. I think I was still in that phase of like, this is what I should do. This is how I was raised, and I want to raise my kids in this. And it wasn't until I would say, I call it my midlife awakening, instead of crisis, but it definitely was a crisis. We went through a pretty hard season in our family with a bunch of health things with our younger daughter, our oldest. She's our daughter. We went through a bunch of health things with her, type 1 diabetes, scoliosis, a loss of my wife's kind of faith mentor. And I would say in this part of our marriage, my wife was farther ahead in her faith journey than I was. But out of that kind of darkness, Heather and I, and Heather's my wife's name, we just were really grateful for what we had. And I started to realize that part of the darkness was I realized I was missing something in my life. And part of that missing thing was I had laid out in college this life plan, the capitalist dream of, CTO, or a high-ranking official at a company, lots of employees, lots of money, big house, cars, all that stuff. And I achieved a lot of that. And I realized in my achieving of that, I was actually at probably the pinnacle of misery in my life. I was one of the most miserable times. And I had this weird, strange thing of like, something's missing. And somehow through that process, well, not somehow, God was really calling me and inviting me in to do faith for me. And that's when it started. Was kind of out of that dark period. I started going to church for me. I started getting involved in things in church for me. And that's really started what I would call I felt like I was always following the Lord, but I didn't have a deep personal relationship. So I kind of call it my second calling into him. And so that's what really started it.
Yeah. I love how you said that. It was an awakening. And it sounded like you something was missing while you really seemed to have it all. You had everything. You had the job, you had the the family,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't really personal there.
Yep.
Okay, so you start
Mm-hmm.
going. Did
Mm-hmm.
you end up having a personal moment of surrender to God, or what was that? What was that like?
Yeah. So, no, I don't have a moment, but
Which is okay, by the way.
yeah,
I
no, I
don't.
know, and
I know not everybody has one, but I like to ask the question that way.
yes. So part of, I'd say there's several things that happened. So part of this midlife awakening, my wife and I were on a date night, and I had brought up the topic of showing the kids the world. They were at this time, I think they were 8 and 10. And I'll never forget it because my wife I think I suggested we go to like Paris or France for 2 weeks. And she said, no, we should move to Africa for a year. And I still think the Holy Spirit possessed her mouth. So we started talking about that. And after a year of planning, we moved our family. We rented our house, quit our jobs, and moved our family to Uganda. And we lived there for about 10 months. And throughout that 10 months, the Lord just did. I had this image of the Lord. It was while He was holding me in His hands, He was breaking so many things about what I knew and understood about myself and about Him. And throughout that period, that's when I really felt this deep personal relationship with my Lord.
Wow. Okay. That was a beautiful way to put it. He was holding you in His hands, but He was breaking you at the same time. So what were some of the things that He was kind of taking out of you or breaking you as you were in Uganda?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing, and this, I always thought this was so interesting. So we went to Uganda. We were living in community, and we were surrounded by both mostly younger Americans. We were in our 40s and they were in their 20s, we'll say. And so we were living in community, but we also were around Ugandans who were deeply faithful. I think the Ugandans taught me more about my faith than I taught them.
Wow.
And they did a thing I think it was every Thursday, called devotions in the morning. And so it was singing and dancing and praying and teaching and in the Word. And I had never experienced such a thing like that. And I remember the first one I'm at, and I'm in that, I like kind of have one eye kind of squinted open, and I'm trying to, not mess up. Not that you can mess up devos, but I didn't know at the time.
Yeah.
I'm trying to not mess up. And I remember the first thing the Lord said was, you must forgive your parents. I'm like, what? You called me, you moved me to Uganda to serve Ugandans. And here you want me to spend time forgiving my parents? So I'll have to say we battled over that for about a few months, but I ended up forgiving my parents, which I didn't even know I had to do until I really thought about it. And it was the first big step. But I always found it was such ironic that I got called to Uganda to work on forgiving my parents.
Wow.
I always find that very interesting.
Wow. That is amazing. Okay. So you go over there and you're thinking about your parents and trying to and forgiving them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that so? What I just want you to take us into that experience, because that, I mean,
Yes.
You can share whatever you want to share or don't. It's fine.
Yeah.
But, like, why was that a thing that God was taking or asking you to do, and how was that either keeping you from Him and like all that?
Yep. Yeah. So a couple things, just a little bit about my parents. My parents and I had been through a really rough stint. They were part of the hard stuff that I mentioned that led to the awakening. And both of them, turns out, were alcoholics, different kind of alcoholics. My dad was 2 bottles of wine by 3 every day. At least that's what it felt like to me.
Did you know that?
My mom, I didn't. It took a while. I mean, it's interesting. I had all these kind of weird rules where I wouldn't call after 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But I didn't know really why I was doing that. And it really wasn't until later in his life. And so there was that struggle. And then my mom she didn't drink, and then she would drink a ton in one day. And it was just really a hard season. And then after 46 years of marriage, they ended up getting divorced. which was really hard to wrap my head around for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And so I think what the Lord was really, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, your dad was a pastor, right?
Yeah.
So
my dad was a pastor.
Yeah. So that kind of makes you go, hey.
You struggle with kind of like, did he believe what he was teaching and stuff? And did he live it? And all that, just a lot of hard things. And it was just a really, for the people who have dealt with addiction, I think the symptoms of addiction and the drinking, while hard, are not the hardest thing. It's the lies that are really, really hard. They break your heart. And it just hurts to see someone you love struggling so badly with something. So I was really struggling with my relationship with my parents at this time. And the other thing I would say is I've termed it now. I've kind of done a little Bonhoeffer with this cheap grace, but I call it cheap forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I had an understanding of forgiveness that went something like, my parents say they're sorry and I forgive them. That's how I understood forgiveness. And I would say in this season, the Lord was really teaching me that forgiveness had nothing to do with anything my parents would ever do. And it had everything to do with changing my heart and how I saw them. And so I had to do a lot of heart work. And I don't think I had done that much heart work in the past. And so this season I was really just in this, so strange. I'm in a foreign place, taking pills so I don't get malaria and thinking about things. And, electricity is hit or miss, and same with the internet and same with water. And I'm living in a community and everything's different. And here I am working on like deep heart change. And it was what I so needed. I needed to let that go. But it was definitely not what I expected.
Yeah. So how did that feel to be doing those kinds of things or going through that sort of personal transformation when that's not really what you went over there for? Yes,
it felt, I always use the word irony. It felt ironic to me. And it was interesting because at the same time, so a little bit more like my wife and I had kind of, how we had organized our family just inherently was, I was kind of I'll just say the money-making arm of our family, and my wife was kind of the volunteer organization of our family. That's how we had kind of set it up.
Now the structure of Gracefull Cafe makes sense.
And so we had set it up kind of like that. And then, and so my wife had done most of the volunteering. I had done some, but Uganda was my wholehearted, like, I don't have a job. Like, my whole definition in many ways was defined about having a job. And now I don't have a job. I'm not making money. I'm dependent on some donations we got and some people from Iceland who are renting our house and, all that. And like, it was really, I think that was one of those things where the Lord was really breaking me, right? That whole lesson in trust.
Yeah.
I have you. I was really being taught that. And part of that was, I think, obedience when he said like, hey, you need to forgive your parents. And I said, no, you're crazy. And we continued an argument I at least argued. He kept telling me the same thing. But like we continued that for some period of time until I finally said, okay, I'll do it. Right. And so I think he was really teaching me the trust and some obedience in that season and to get deeper into my heart.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because at the same time, so going back to I was volunteering for the first time. Well, we didn't really have a set thing we were doing when we showed up in Uganda, which turned out to be a huge blessing. The organization had never had a family before. Our kids were going to a Ugandan school. The organization had a school, and I was just showing up. And to be honest, I was just reading the Bible because it's the only book I had. And I didn't have anything else to do. Meanwhile, my wife was somehow finding things to do, and I was very bored. And so at the same time, I'm kind of arguing with the Lord about forgiveness. I'm arguing about him a little bit like, why did you bring us here? Like, I'm just sitting around reading a book. I could do that anywhere. Like, why here? And I don't know what the moment was, but one day I feel like the scales fell from my eyes and I saw all the work I could be doing. And then suddenly I was very busy, but it was this process that had to happen within me for me to see it. I don't how to explain it any better than that.
Yeah.
It was there the whole time. I just couldn't see it. And so I was bored, but there was so much to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, God was really, he was really digging into you. It sounds like he was opening things up for you in ways that he apparently wanted to do. I loved his persistence and gentleness with you in asking, just saying, okay, no, you need to forgive your parents. You need to forgive your parents. And allowing you, because I think this is an underrated attribute of God. His persistence and allowing us to simply be where we are. He's not actually, we always want to be further along than we are. And we have this, especially as Americans, we have this idea that we need to achieve our spiritual being, right? Which is why my show's called Halfway There, by the way. We're on a journey, I'm trying to say. But instead, the Lord is just inviting us into this conversation with him, and to like you said, obedience and to follow. All of those things are really good. That's a really great example. Thank you for sharing that story.
No worries.
Yeah. Okay. So God's working on you in Uganda. What was there anything else big that kind of came out of that? And then you eventually came back, and then kind of tell us what happened then.
Yes. There was just there's nothing big. There was just so many moments of just understanding kind of his presence. I'll give one example and give two more examples. The other example that comes to mind just readily is I'm a planner by nature. So I like, I already heard in somewhere in sophomore year of college, I laid out a life plan. And so I like to do plans, right? So that's how I like to control things, as tasks. And so I remember I had started in this process, my journal, you can see this moment where my journal totally changes from kind of this regurgitation of my day to what's going on in my head. And I love looking back at that point in my journal. But also one day in my journal, I decided to write my plans for the day. And then I ended my journal with a prayer, but God, today is your day. I'll just go where you take me. And so with that in mind, I left. And so I go to do my first thing in my journal. It's total wreck.
Yeah.
As things, when you get into a foreign country, things don't work as you expect them to. Ugandans have a different understanding of time than we do. And so, which is beautiful and in its difference. And so I get to my first thing, and literally nothing else on my list can happen that day. And I'm just like, okay. And I remember that day I did so many different things. And when I got home and I was recapping the day in my journal, I couldn't believe the beauty that came out of that day. And it all became because I didn't have a list. And one of the things I think I learned in that moment that I often tell people is I think sometimes we plan God out of our schedule. We've actually give him no room to move in what we have in a day because it's so full with other things that there's no place for God to move. And so I always try and leave a little space, or sometimes even a lot of space, to just let God move in my day. So that was one of the other big things that happened. And then the final thing you touched on was throughout this process, I feel like I had this transformation. And so we're about a month from coming home. And I can kind of sense in my family that they're kind of getting ready. They're kind of getting done. They're just kind of ready to be back. And I don't want to leave. I remember being a Devo and I'm bawling, like out of control, sobbing, like that crazy guy crying. And I didn't even know why. And as we're walking, my wife's like, is everything okay? I'm like, no, I can't go home. We need to stay here forever. She's like, no, that's not going to work. And so just to quicken the story a little bit, what ended up happening was I just had to reframe what that was. And my great fear was that word going back. I didn't want to go back. I felt like I was a new Troy. And if I went back, I would become who I was that I no longer was anymore. If that makes sense.
Yes, you were like afraid.
Gravity would pull me back, right?
Yeah.
And the Lord just gave me so many, including a dream and other things. The Lord just spoke into that, so I rephrased it and reframed it as I was continuing on. And as I thought about that was something I could get excited about, but going back was terrifying to me. So I think the final thing he taught me was to continue on, and that I didn't have to go back.
Yeah. Which is interesting because so I hear you saying you were afraid you had to become the person that you were before because you didn't know how to be the new person that God had made you in the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So
Exactly.
you mentioned you had a dream. Is that something you want to tell us about? Because I know people. I'm 100% convinced that God still works in these ways. And so if it was formational, I'd love for people just to hear the story in order to go at least be aware and kind of listening,
Okay. Yeah, this is great. I think I'm meant to tell this. I have not told this very much. So the dream is I'm standing on a dock, a very big wood dock, and there's boats in the background, which is really interesting because we weren't on the water in Uganda or anything, nor have I did anyways. And so I'm on this dock, and this person approaches me that has like all the mentors in my life are rolled up into this one person. And I think to this day it was Jesus, but and this person starts talking to me, and I don't really remember the conversation, but I remember in the point of having this great conversation, I reach into my pocket and there's something in it, like really big, bigger than keys and stuff. And so I reach in my pocket and I pull out and I look at it, and for some reason I know it's a huge uncut diamond. And I'm looking at this, and I look to, I'm just going to use the word Jesus, and I say, how much is this worth? And for whatever reason, he speaks very loudly, and he says, it's priceless, it's invaluable. And he says it loudly. And at that moment, I feel like everyone on this crowded dock is looking at me and coveting and wanting to steal my diamond. And that was the dream. And so I woke up and I was like kind of excited because that seemed like a pretty impactful dream to me. And I'm telling, we're kind of gathering for breakfast. And I'm telling some people in the community room like what had happened. And I'm like, what do you think it means? And I remember one of the guys looks at me, he's like, you totally know what that means. And I'm like, I do? And he's like, yes. And he didn't answer the question. And I thought about it. And it was what I was saying. It was that, to me, that uncut diamond was what my faith had become. And part of my fear of going back was that people would somehow take that from me, but they couldn't. But recognizing they could never take it from me was part of the dream, and at least the meaning that I had from the dream.
Yes. Wow. So they could not take away the value that God had given you.
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Was that a reassuring?
Yes, that was a pretty pivotal dream on giving me the return from Uganda. I'll say it that way.
Yeah, right. It convinced you. It sounds like that you could go. Okay,
yes,
we
that
can
I could go
home.
and that I had this thing of value, but that it couldn't be taken from me. I could only give it. I think was part of it.
Wow.
Like I could only give it away. So if I went back, it was only because I gave up things that were important to me versus them being stolen, which I don't think I understood.
Yeah, but Jesus is faithful to tell you that.
Yep.
Oh man, how cool! Thank you for sharing that. So that's a great story. I love that one. So you come back, and I don't know how long it was before you guys started Gracefull, but fill that in for us.
Yeah, so we got back in 2002. That was 2013, and so my wife is now thinking. Part of one of her things in Uganda was that she wrote in her journal. Well, she doesn't journal that often, but she wrote that she was meant to open a restaurant. And so she comes back and she taught business at high school and she was a CPA. So she does what any business person would do. She starts laying out a business plan. So she starts creating that. I'm supporting her. I don't know that it's feeling that serious to me still. And then then one day she tells me that she thinks she should get a job in the restaurant industry. So she works at this local breakfast place called Snooze here in town.
Oh, yeah.
And she's a hostess. And there she is working there for about a year and continue work on our business plan. And time kind of is tricky sometimes. But at one point she tells me at dinner or something, hey, I think we should start looking for properties. And that's when it hit me that we were serious about this restaurant thing. And so that I better start kind of getting on board with that. And so, yeah, we started looking for properties. And we found this cute little 1912 house in this historic downtown Littleton. And Heather said, this is the place. And the Lord was faithful in that. It looked like it was going to fall through many times. But it came through, and I think we bought the place in 2015. And then we started remodeling it because it was formerly a tea shop. And so we started remodeling it to open. It was a 1912 house. It had really like 3 rooms, and we wanted to make it one big community room. So we removed walls and did all that stuff. And then we got ready to open in May of 2016.
Wow. And then how does that work? Because I think people come and volunteer there, right?
Yes. So, I mean, great question. So we have paid staff. So we have a barista every day. We have a paid chef. And someday my wife her position will pull some pay. We're working to that. And then we have 6 volunteers a day that do food prep. They run the dishes, and they also they run and get the dishes and bring the food out to people. And then there's someone that washes dishes. So we have like through 2.5 to 3 hour shifts, 2 times a day. And so we have this beautiful volunteer community that steps into what we do every day, and serves people, a plate of good food. One of our core values is to keep it simple and to limit waste. So we have a very small menu. So for breakfast, we have 3 things. And for lunch, we have 4 things. And we just try and keep it very simple, and serve those things really well, make them fresh every day, and just love people with really good food.
Mm-hmm. Which I love that. It's actually sometimes the best places are the ones that have a simple menu, right? Because you just know what you can get. And
yep.
I love that. So I will attest that the burritos are really great. And yesterday I had the traditional, and it was really good too. So you really can't go wrong. It's delicious. Okay, so what can we talk about the way that people can come, and whether you can pay or not, that's
right.
That's the thing. But it gets a little interesting, right? Because you have a clientele that isn't traditional. And there's a lot of reasons for that, probably. Yes. So talk to us about that. And because I love the way that you're ministering to them, and just by being creating space for them.
Right. So many stories, but I'll start with some numbers, just give everyone a perspective.
Right.
So we serve between 100 and 120 meals a day. About 50 to 60 of those are what we call Grace in Action. That's our program where you don't have to pay meals. So about half of the clientele, anytime you come into a restaurant, are either experiencing homelessness, living out of the car, surfing couches, or some other way of really just trying to make it work. And I think one of the things that's really, I think we sit in this interesting space. We're not a coffee shop because we serve food. We're not a soup kitchen, but we're yet not a regular cafe.
Right.
We sit in these in-between space, and we just try and have a full representation of the community we live in. So if you take the paying option off the table, we try and represent who all is in our community, and just create this welcoming space where we want to know your name, and we want you to know your story, and we want you to know our story. And we just try and invest in people that way. And so just trying to create that community space, invite people through volunteering, or just coming to have a meal with us, and just maybe having a conversation with someone they wouldn't often meet.
Yeah.
And creating this really safety is a big word we use a lot. Having this safe environment. I mean, I won't say it's not challenging,
right?
But it is safe.
Well,
safety is very important to us, but it is a challenging, because you will meet people that you wouldn't normally associate with, especially if you're in the middle class, you wouldn't normally associate with these people. But there's something so beautiful in their story and who they are, and in what they've been through, and what they're still going through, and just the understanding of their experience, I think is so educational and something we need to hear in our society today.
Yeah. But some of the people who come are homeless, right? And they're
Yes.
addicts, and you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
they've got a story. But
Mhm.
anyway, I like the way that you create a safe space. I think everybody's very respectful. It is this very interesting community of people to be like, I'm part of this, I'm part of,
Yep.
by coming here and supporting, I'm part of ministering in the way that you guys do, which I love.
Right.
So
Right.
you mentioned challenges, and I wanted to see, like, so tell us what some of the challenges are. And maybe, because people listen to this show all over the world. And so maybe they're somewhere else, other places, England or Australia or Africa themselves.
Yep.
What could they learn from your experience about how to deal with challenging people, or, creating that space?
Yeah. I mean, lots to talk about there. I think where I'd start with is names. I think, like, when I read the Bible now and when I see Jesus change someone's name or call them something else, or God change someone's name, and really important people's names they change, I think that reminds us how important it is to not only to hear your name said, but also to know someone's name. And I've heard that over and over from our guests, especially the ones experiencing homelessness, that they live in a world, they'll say something like this: I live in a world where no one cares that I exist, and I come in here and you want to know my name.
Wow.
And that might be the first time that someone has really tried to interact with them and know their name. And so I think we can't underestimate the power of knowing someone's name. So the other thing I think that I would say is, I mentioned that word safety. Safety and comfort are not the same thing to me.
Right.
Safety means that you feel safe in our space, and that is very important to us. So we have a thing called breaks that we take with people when they make people not feel safe in our space. And we will talk to them and say, hey, we need to take a break, and we'll come up with some time based on whatever happened, and try and speak to them like, hey, people didn't feel safe when you acted that way. And so we'll talk about that. And to a person, we've never had anyone that doesn't observe and understand. They may not understand why they're on break, but they observe it and they respect it. And I think that's part of it's you have to give to receive, I think.
Yeah.
And part of us giving is we want to know their name, and we try to let them know that we really want to know who they are and we really value them. But they also have to be very respectful of our community, because we want people to feel that from everyone.
Yeah.
And so I think what I would say, dealing with challenges is, we're going through other challenges, personal ones and not, but like some level of just trying to enter into the hard, rather than avoiding it, but enter into it, and just trying to be respectful and loving, but also say like, hey, like you can't act this way. Right. And I'm not saying to be mean. I'm just saying, like, it doesn't make people feel safe when you do this, or it's disrespectful, or this is why we want to do this and create this community. And I think we all, like, I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about living in a community until I lived in it. And so I had lost the concept of community until I was immersed in it. And so I think that's one of the things we try and teach people is, how do we all be together? And what I would say is, we come from different places. We come from what I would say society rules, which, if you look at society rules, there's a lot about, I think in our society, there's a lot of, especially American society, like, do it on yourself, fix it yourself, get well by yourself. There's this like individualistic kind of value we have. And then if you look at street rules are respect is number one, never back down, all this. And neither are community living rules, neither society rules that we live in kind of, or street rules. And so teaching people to come together with a new set of rules is what we spend a lot of time entering into and trying to do.
Wow. Okay. That's really profound and powerful. I love the way you frame it too as safety, because I think everybody understands that. right?
Mhm.
There's nobody who wants to feel unsafe.
Right.
And so when you frame something around safety, it's easy to go, okay, I don't want to make people feel that way. Everybody is that way. But then to also put that safety as a value of our community, and that's then we're all together. And so nobody's trying to get more than the other person or whatever, however that works, we're all welcome here. Wow. That is just such a beautiful picture. I love it. Man, I'm sure there's a lot more that we could talk about, Troy, about your story. I know there is, and maybe we can do a follow-up sometime. But I want to just encourage you, friends, if you have a place like Gracefull Cafe near you, go volunteer or show up and give, go down, have a meal, and meet some people, because it really is something that will change your life. And then if you're in Littleton, you're in Denver, because I know a lot of us are, come on down and check it out. You just may find me there. I do a lot of my coffee meetings there in the morning now. So it would be really fun to do that. I've got links to your website. So if people want to find out more, if they want to, give or talk to you, they can just go to the show notes at halfwaytherepodcast.com, or your website is, I got it right here, gracefullcafe.com. So people can find that as well. Troy, is there anything you want to leave us with?
I always say I need buckets of patience and truckfuls of trust. And that is just trying to trust in what the Lord has for each of us, and seeing what I would say, one of the things I've learned in all these conversations I've gotten to have with so many different community people, from people experiencing homelessness, like I said, living in their cars, to middle class and upper class folks. The more conversations I have, the more I realize we all experience very similar things. And truly, I believe that God has created each one of us in our image, and he's given us each a special task or gift to do and share with this world. And I would just so encourage each person to find whatever that is. Maybe it's graceful, probably isn't, but there is something you're called to do to make this world a much better place. And I would just encourage you to go into that, try and seek it, find it, walk through the really hard stuff, and see where it takes you. Because I guarantee you it will be totally different and changed, and it will be really, really good.
Wow, that is so true. Every time someone embraces who God's made them to be and acts out in it, very good things happen. The world has changed for the better. And it's a travesty that so many of us allow our circumstances to not do that. I think God is calling us to do it. So friends, maybe there's a way. Maybe there's a way. Maybe there's a little thought in the back of your mind that you're like, maybe I should pay attention to that. Do it. And let's see what God does, and let us know. So you can hit up Troy at gracefullcafe.com or me at halfwaytherepodcast.com. I would love to hear how God is moving you. Troy, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you sharing your story.
Happy to be here. My pleasure.